I have most definitely made some mistakes as a programmer, mistakes that have led to less than great quality code, mistakes that have wasted a ton of time, and mistakes that overall just made me kind of not as good at my job. And a lot of these mistakes were made more frequently when I was just starting out, but I would say even when talking to my engineering manager right now who has, decades of experience, he still even runs into these mistakes every once in a while. So I don't think these are necessarily unique to a junior developer, but I do think that if you can kind of learn from these mistakes and avoid them, that you will most definitely become a better programmer, save yourself some time, and just overall improve the kind of quality of your code. So, the first mistake that I'm going to go over, and I have 9 that come to mind that are mistakes that I've definitely made. So, the first one is going to be trying to be clever. So, I think a lot of this stems from me being a self-taught developer. And when I first started out a handful of years ago, it was really important for me to show that like I was a good programmer, that I could do the job. It was like this insecurity of being self-taught and needing to kind of prove myself. And what this led me to do is in certain situations or for certain problems, I would go for the clever solution rather than maybe the more simple, straightforward solution. And I know that there was a time in the past where, I was learning all about how the JavaScript task queues work and different things like that. And how if you use set timeout, it's actually an asynchronous function and it will place the function you pass into set timeout into the task queue, and then it will run it later at a certain point when all of your synchronous code has completed running. So you can kind of adjust when code is going to run by putting it in a set timeout, even with a 0 second set timeout. And I would occasionally use like these 0 second timeouts in my code to kind of change the running of when I want some code to run. And I quite easily could have used something like a JavaScript promise or even restructure my code in a more straightforward way so I don't have to do anything like that. And that would have been a much more kind of maintainable and readable way to solve that problem rather than trying to get clever with it. And over the long run, this just leads to, other people on my team seeing that code, not really knowing what's going on, not because like they're not as clever as I am, but because that's not code that you see every day. And that's not code you should see every day. And it wasn't well structured, maintainable, readable code. So, one mistake is trying to be clever, trying to do things just for the sake of, ooh, that's this little quirk of this programming language that would actually allow this to work. When in reality, there's probably a better, more simple way to do it. I think going with a simpler solution is usually better, not always, but usually better. The second mistake I made is only using the first solution that I found to a problem. There has been several times in which I have, not known how to solve something. I look up a solution, I just see the first solution and I use that. And one time I did this is when I was working on an application and I needed to sign a user out of this kind of browser when they signed out of this browser. So handling like multi-browser signouts. And off the top of my head, I didn't really know how to do that. So I looked it up, and the first solution I found, that's the one I implemented. And the solution, come to find out, it actually used a JavaScript function that wasn't supported in like the Safari browser. So it only worked in Google Chrome. And I did my development in Chrome. So I implemented the solution and I was like, hey, it works. But later down the road, we had some bugs because it didn't work in Safari, and different users, when they're on like their iPhone, just using Safari as their default browser or even other browsers, they ran into an error. And this just is one example of it's often best to look at a handful of solutions. Maybe look at 3 or 4 different solutions and see, okay, what is the benefit of writing this code this way or solving this problem this way compared to over here? And is one of these solutions maybe a little bit more robust over the long run? And I think that when you have a problem, searching for multiple solutions rather than just going to kind of the first solution that you find is almost always a better approach. Now, that doesn't mean that you should spend, hours and hours and hours just looking at every single solution possible. But I would say at least find, a few of the most popular ways to solve a problem and see if one of those works better or worse depending on the use cases of your application. Number 3, never asking questions. So by nature, I'm just a very kind of stubborn person that likes to do things on their own, and I really just don't like to ask for help with anything. And I think that this has definitely wasted a lot of developer time and my own time over the years, in which there's probably been several situations in which like I could just ask my engineering manager, send him a quick Slack message and get a yes or no answer. And that kind of unblocks me to move me forward. And it would have taken, 30 seconds of his time. And I would just be too stubborn to ask that question. And I think that there's definitely a balance here to where, if you don't know how to do something, I definitely think that you should still look it up and try to figure it out first. But if there's like a low cost way to ask for help and unblock yourself, you should definitely do that as well. I think that the skill here is realizing when you should ask questions and when you should kind of just try to figure it out for yourself. And I would say in situations to where someone on your team knows how to solve a certain problem in a certain way that's going to work really well, ask them to just kind of like, hey, could you point me in the right direction? But if you're pretty confident that, maybe you have the most expertise in this area and no one else on your team is really going to know a really kind of straightforward path here off the top of their heads, then at that point, you might just have to figure that one out on yourself. And I think it takes some experience with this, but try to find that balance between, not asking every single little question and taking everyone else's time, but also if someone would have like a solution off the top of their head that they could answer to you within, just a couple minutes, I think that those are questions worth asking. Number 4, jumping into code before fully understanding the problem at hand. So I can't tell you how many times to where I would read through one of our like Jira tickets or one problem that I'm trying to solve, and I would kind of get a rough overview and I would just start writing code. And I wouldn't actually think about like, okay, what problem for our product are we trying to solve here? And I would just think about the code solution that I knew would probably solve this issue. And I think that this often results in kind of wasting time because you write code to solve a problem that wasn't actually the problem that was trying to be represented in that task. And that just kind of wastes all of your time there. And I also think that, trying to think like product first and thinking about your users, like what experience are we actually trying to go for here? Rather than just maybe jumping into a code solution that, might be pretty complex. Maybe there's a simpler solution that still gets to that user experience you want, but it's just pretty straightforward and doesn't take a bunch of time. So I think there's definitely a balance there. And there's also a balance with this one to where like, I also don't think it's best to like spend days and days and days just like doing design documents on every single problem that you have. And I think that there is an aspect to this to where sometimes it's hard to know the best solution to a problem until you actually dive into the code and you go to implement that solution. Because almost always, especially for a larger, more complex task, things come up as you're implementing it to where you have to kind of adjust how you solve that problem. So again, there's kind of that dichotomy here as well, in which you want to fully understand the problem that you're trying to solve before you just go write code. But you also don't just want to spend days and days and days trying to design something in which it might inevitably change when you go to implement the solution in code. Number 5, only testing the happy path. So I can't tell you how many times in maybe like my first year of development in which I would work on a problem. I'd be so happy because I'd get the solution, I'd get the code written, and only come to find that this solution actually has issues with the solution when I do some more testing on a poor internet connection, or I test some different kind of user inputs that I would expect, and not just like they perfectly type in their address in the input box and, everything just works. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, Ed. You know what I've talked about if you have experience with user inputs. And also testing on different browsers, how things look on a mobile device. I come from a front-end developer background, so that's kind of where this is, but I'm sure there's maybe more back-end specific things as well that apply to, not only testing the happy path, also testing for different time zones or considering different time zones and stuff like that as well. So don't just test like the perfect path in which, the user just perfectly has great internet connection. They input exactly what you think. They use, the browser that you use while developing. They, have this big desktop computer. They're not using a small screen, and they also happen to be using the time zone you're in. That's pretty rare to happen. So make sure to really try to hammer on your solution and see if it breaks. And yes, this takes more time, and this, might lead to slowing down your development, but over the long run, it's actually going to save you time because you build a more robust kind of code base and more robust application. Number 6, taking feedback personally. So early on in my career, I would see like, I'd make a PR, push my code up to GitHub and request a review from my engineering manager, and I would get a notification back saying changes requested. And there's like early on in my career, it would like, I would go look at that feedback right away, like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? I'm such a bad programmer and stuff like that. And I think over time, I've been better and better about like separating myself as a person from the code I write. Like, yeah, I've written some bad code, but that doesn't mean like I'm necessarily a bad programmer or a bad person because I accidentally had some bugs in my code. And we'll get to that a little bit more in point number 9. But I think it's important to like separate your own like personal identity from the code you write, and not take feedback personally, and understand that that feedback is likely coming from a place of just wanting to have a more quality, robust application, and that individual, especially early on in your career, if they're giving you feedback, it's probably because they've made the mistakes you're making in your code, and it's just like an opportunity to learn. Number 7, working nonstop and being eager to please. So this kind of goes back to me being a self-taught programmer and wanting to really kind of please my engineering manager and to prove myself. I would kind of work around the clock. Like, I'm generally a person that likes working hard and getting up early, and I'm not like a big TV or entertainment guy, so I tend to work quite a bit. And I think in some sense, like, this is good. And I personally work for startups, and I like working for startups because there's a little bit more of a culture of like, let's move quickly, let's work hard. And that just kind of fits my personality better. So I think in that sense, like, this is a good trait. But in another sense, it can kind of make you resent coding a little bit. And it can make you kind of no longer like your job if like you go to work on Monday, but you're so burnt out from working across the weekend that you don't even want to show up. Like, that's also not a good kind of relationship to have with it. And you also don't leave yourself any time for like career development and to actually improve your skills as a programmer. And I think like my first year, I was working like 10-hour days around the clock, trying to just get more work done than anybody else on my team. And I think that this just led to like, not spending time improving my skills outside of work and different things like that, that just didn't do me well in the long term when it comes to career development and stuff like that. So again, this is another one to where I think there's a balance here. I think it's good to work hard. I personally like working a lot and stuff like that. But if you're working so much to where you don't leave room for kind of career development or to kind of unwind a little bit and you start like resenting coding, I think that's a good sign that maybe you're a little bit too far on that spectrum of working a bit too much. Number 8, not realizing that, for whatever comes up, there's likely always a solution to that problem. Like early on in my career, we would be planning our sprint. So we do work in 2-week sprints to where we plan out all of our tasks in these kind of like 2-week increments. And I would see like my sprint having like 10 to 15 different tasks that I needed to do. And I would see like a handful of them being like things that it's like, wow, I have no idea how to solve this problem. And, I can't tell you how many times I've felt that way when planning out those tasks and feeling that kind of like overwhelm, but always being able to solve those problems. And it's not like I'm this like crazy, amazing programmer that can always solve problems I don't know how to do, but it's always to say that even if things are like overwhelming at first glance, usually if you break the problem down into small chunks, there's always a solution to it. And you should be confident in yourself for figuring that out. And it kind of just took me experience of, years of feeling that overwhelm in that like sprint planning phase. And then also gaining the experience of, hey, you feel this overwhelm, but you always end up, getting a lot done and figuring things out. So when kind of planning out your work, some tasks might feel like almost like impossible. Like, how am I ever going to solve this? I have no way how to solve it. But I think once you dive into that problem, you'll start to see solutions that you didn't see at first glance. And, getting overwhelmed definitely isn't going to help out. And I think as you gain more experience, you'll realize that there are solutions to those tricky problems, especially if you're able to kind of break things down, chunk them down into smaller solvable problems. Then you'll find that big problem kind of works itself out in the end. And number 9, as I alluded to earlier about writing bugs, I would get just like pretty angry with myself and beat myself up about like writing a bug, having an issue in my code base, like that multi-browser issue. When it came up that users were having an issue on different browsers with cross-browser signing out, that really bothered me. And like, I kind of took it personally. Like, that was definitely my area that I was focusing on. And I definitely wrote the code that led to that bug. And I think that for me, just kind of acknowledging that over years of coding, bugs are going to happen and that they are more so a time for you to kind of learn and be like, hey, why did this occur? In that situation that I talked about, that occurred because I only tested the happy path. I didn't consider multi-browser support, testing on mobile, different things like that. So now that I've made those mistakes, in the future, when I write code, I try to make those considerations so I don't write those bugs again. And I think that no matter how good a programmer is, you're going to write bugs from time to time. And that doesn't mean that like you should just accept that and continue to write bugs, but it does mean that it's like, hey, it happens. It's going to happen. I've written a lot of bugs. I'm going to write more bugs in the future, but they hopefully won't be the same bugs or be a result of the same mistakes I've made in the past, because I kind of accept that they happen and I learn from them rather than just like getting angry with myself and getting down on myself and stuff like that. So those are 9 mistakes that I've made, that a lot of programmers I've communicated with have made, and hopefully you can kind of learn from those and be a better programmer because of it. So thanks for tuning into this. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in that next one.